The first episode of Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood is pure, predictable propaganda. And that only makes the story stronger. Stay tuned. And if you'd like to see more Toonoscopy, sub, ding, and let me know down in the comments what you'd like to see me feature next. Before we go full weeb, I want to talk about Save the Cat. It's a sometimes loved, sometimes hated model for constructing stories. It revolves around a handful of semi-universal landmarks, or beats, that a story, air quotes, should hit in order to be effective. In short, it's a formula for making stories from scratch. And that's the point where some people get very excited and some people cringe away real hard. But let me explain how this relates to Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. You could go through, word by word, for an episode or the whole series, trying to prove how heavily it does or doesn't rely on some outside set of blueprints or universal story DNA. But that's not my intention. What I do want to impress here is that intentionally or incidentally, all stories follow patterns. However, in my opinion, the most effective, the most exceptional stories are the ones that take advantage of not only these patterns, but the reader expectations that reliance upon these patterns has generated. I want to use episode 1 of the series to explain this because I think that the entire episode is built around misleading and distracting the viewer with carefully chosen information, as well as when and how that information is doled out. Funny that sounds just like propaganda. In a show about statewide military conspiracy? No. Oh, by the way, if you haven't figured it out, we may have some spoilers here. Don't whine about it. So, that propaganda similarity feels intentional. It looks as if it deliberately echoes the setup, messages, and themes of the whole series. And by taking advantage of other baggage we bring into the story as humans, and lifelong consumers of stories and storytelling, Brotherhood can roll these intentional decisions together with some of that saving the cat formula blueprint stuff, and trick you into buying into the story faster. And I think that makes the whole story stronger and more focused. Let's look at Isaac McDougal. He's literally the first character we meet in Brotherhood. Incidentally, he was also created just for this version of Fullmetal. He's not directly featured in the manga or the original show. He's skulking in a back alley, cloaked and scrawling a transmutation circle in the dark. Less than a minute later, we're meeting Ed, who is cast as immediately brusque and impatient with a disdain for authority. And this is important. We're told, explicitly, that McDougal is a criminal, that he should be inherently unlikable. But we're shown that Ed might not be the most pleasant person to deal with. We have an explicit bad guy and an implicit good guy right away. And the expectation is that we will like the good guy and dislike the bad automatically. This is reinforced as the first encounter between these characters begins with McDougal straight up murdering some dudes. He's not made out to be a nice guy here, freezing, boiling, and stabbing people as he flees from the law. And then Ed enters the scene with a dramatic mini-speech about murder. A fight ensues, and again this dynamic is enforced. Ed equals good, McDougal equals bad. And even as we're given more screen time to adjust to these characters, the pattern is basically the same. The information we're allowed to receive is deliberate and one-sided. Ed is welcomed by people who admire and respect him, and discusses hopeful future plans with his younger brother. McDougal is shown plotting literal terrorism and breaking into prisons to recruit conspirators. It's clear who we're supposed to root for. But the thing is, we don't really have enough information to make that decision. It's all guts. We're forced to come to that conclusion in a relatively short amount of time, having been exposed to so little information. So, by necessity and nature, our decision is both quick and incomplete. It's based on half of a story, and baggage we carried into the show with ourselves. What's happening here is part of that save the cat dynamic. The book I'm referencing here uses a tool called a beat sheet as a sort of roadmap for constructing a story. It includes items like opening image or midpoint that make sense on their own, and some that need more context like Dark Night of the Soul or Bad Guys Close In. These are essentially archetypal story landmarks that can be used to guide the shaping of a story. However, there is no point called Save the Cat. That's actually more of an extra tool for which the whole method is named. Essentially, the idea is that you have a character perform a redeeming act so that the audience will perceive them as likable. The given example is literally saving a cat from a tree. Now, this can be done cynically, like you just make the douchebag do a nice so he doesn't seem so obnoxious, or it can be calculating, like we've seen so far in Brotherhood. The biggest reasons we view Ed and McDougal the way we do is because we've been fed this subtly manipulating information. For those who need the refresher, McDougal's goal is to bring down the Amestrian government due to its role in basically trying to destroy millions of lives for the gain of 3 people. And the Elrics want to recover their bodies after a taboo experiment that destroyed them. The big irony of this first episode and the whole Brotherhood series is that figures like McDougal are closer to being the actual good guys, quote-unquote, than supposedly noble figures like Fuhrer Bradley or even the Elrics themselves. And the series spends its entirety deconstructing that idea of who is good, who is evil, and why. Our tendency to assume that anyone who fights bad guys and has relatively innocent or pure intentions is the good guy is used to trick us, as well as giving us a look at the whole of Brotherhood in a nutshell before we dive in. Through both experience and exposure, we're trained to look for mental shortcuts like these to understand the flow and intention of a story. This trick isn't done just to be clever, it actually serves a purpose. McDougal's actions are reinforced as evil, specifically to frame the actions of Ed, Al, and the rest of the military as just or righteous. We don't, and simply can't, have enough information to contradict this assumption because we're not in charge of the flow of information from the storytellers to the audience. We're being propagandized by God, and when we finally do have enough information to know that we've been manipulated, we're too invested to turn back. And if you're paying attention, you'll notice that this exact situation plays out over and over again for Ed and Al in the Brotherhood narrative. This revelation, when taken in context with the rest of the story, echoes the themes of the whole series at the same time that it introduces us to the world, its characters, and their conflicts. This is a lot like the openings of Shakespeare's plays, where a short but poignant scene is used to set the tone and intention for the rest of the work. I've been harping on about story structure, expectation, and formula this whole time, but who cares? How does this all contribute to a show like Brotherhood without suddenly making everything rigid and predictable? I believe that having a story's basic skeleton in place, potentially relying on some kind of outside guide or formula, actually does the exact opposite. It's counterintuitive, right? You'd think that if everyone just followed the same map, we'd all go the same place. But reality is a little more nuanced than that. Say you're cooking spaghetti. Everyone knows what spaghetti is supposed to be, right? Spaghetti sauce and spaghetti noodles. But is everyone's pasta dinner the same? No, of course not. Some use different spices, some use fresh tomatoes, some people even put some meatballs in there. If stories are a spaghetti dinner, those formulas I've talked about are just basic recipes. It's the deft use of skill, experience, and preference that gives you meatballs. How those structures are manipulated, how those basic forms are understood, deconstructed, and reconstructed are what make a story go from okay to exceptional. A story, like Brotherhood, with its core formula in place, is free to build its world on a stable foundation, and the presence of that strong fundamental base allows rules to be broken and subverted in service of the story and its themes, while that same strong base is what allows a story to stand firm even when conventional rules are broken. But again, who cares? Why can't we just get rid of all this formulaic road mapping, unoriginal story crap? Why can't we just make things from scratch? That's what talented artists do, right? Why can't we just do what we want and be completely new, free, and original? Well, because 100% originality is a delusion. Simple fact. The real skill in art isn't in creating something from whole cloth. It's from understanding what's come before you and determining how it worked, deconstructing those previous works, and taking for yourself what you determine to be effective while discarding the bits and pieces you find unnecessary, and then reconstructing those pieces and synthesizing them with your own thoughts and ideas. You instill the bits you steal with parts of yourself to make new art that's so much stronger than pure innovation and arrogance can be. So, to start winding down, I want to say that we shouldn't be afraid of formula, that we should be willing to embrace proven structures for what they really are. Tools. Means to an end. Simple building blocks that we can assemble into something greater than the sum of their parts. The goal is to take these things and use them without becoming trapped in rigid structure. Because carbon copies are lifeless things that lack the spirit and joy of real art. But at the same time, an unwillingness to acknowledge the contributions of the past and people who've blazed trails before you can lead to unfocused, undisciplined, and ineffective work. And even if you're not the artist producing some work, there's room here in this way of thinking to help you enjoy art in new, more meaningful ways. When we can all see those underlying structures that hold up the books, movies, and TV we love, then we can spend less time wrapped up in the functional broad strokes of a piece, and more time understanding why those pieces move the way they do, and how they serve the purposes they were designed to serve. When we watch a show like Brotherhood and understand how our expectations of a given situation might be played with, we can spend less time asking if we're being misled and think with more depth about why we're being misled. Why the authors, artists, and directors wanted us to see the story in a certain way. Why they wanted to give us this information instead of that. And why they want us to feel about characters the way they tell us to. We learn to question what we're told instead of just going along for the ride. And in doing so, not only do we gain a more thorough understanding for the media we enjoy, we form a deeper emotional attachment and can begin to understand more of why we enjoy something. And the greatest part of all this is that we'll begin to understand more of ourselves at the same time. Because the truth is, no one passes through art untouched, and the truth is rarely free. That's all, folks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on Toonoscopy.
If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing. And if you're feeling extra saucy, check out patreon.com/Toonoscopy to see how you can help support the show.